Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Buzz, presented by OTGBasketball.com and NetsRepublic.com. I'm your host, Nick Fay. With me, the traveling man, Jac Manuell. What's up, Jac?
In Vietnam, Nets basketball's only a couple of days away. Life is pretty good, Nicholas. Life is pretty good.
I know you're handing out Nets tickets everywhere you go. Jac's been to like 100 countries in the last week, so. But today we're talking Rondae Hollis-Jefferson+DeMarre Carroll, season preview for these guys. Before we get started, as always, check us out on iTunes, Blog Talk Radio, OTGBasketball.com, NetsRepublic.com, YouTube, and Dash Radio. But Jac, we're going to look back at last year. We'll start with Rondae. Season review of him. Took some major strides offensively, that mid-range, that post-game, the and ones. He was probably one of the best and most consistent Nets last year. What were your thoughts on Rondae last year?
Yeah, definitely one of the most consistent performers, Nick. One of the Nets Republic guys even had him as the Nets' best player last season. You could certainly make an argument for that. I know I did a 2017-18 season review piece on his individual play for OTG basketball. And yeah, I'd certainly echo the sentiment that you made in terms of his offensive game and his shot creation really heading to the next level. His mentality, his confidence was certainly evident throughout all the games he played. He had a couple of games missed due to injury, but so did plenty of our Nets. But a really, really successful season as we get to the success and disappointment for Rondae last season.
Yeah, and you said it, when he missed time, him and Karis LeVert missed time in February, and that really impacted the team because those two brought a lot of energy. Also, I know some people don't really care about statistics, but he was the highest defensive win shares on the Nets last year, so definitely an impact on both ends of the floor. But success or disappointment last year, Jac?
Yeah, hinted at it a little bit before, Nick, but it's an absolute success for Rondae. If you're talking about the fact that he didn't add the three-point shot, then I think you're looking at his overall game fair too narrowly. There's just so many other wide improvements that he made to his game. The consistency on the defensive end, he's probably one of our best defenders. And you mentioned the defensive win shares there. The game against Portland where he played, 37 minutes or so. He's one of our most important performers on both ends of the floor. He still struggles at times, but we'll get that to with the strengths and weaknesses. But yeah, he was absolutely successful throughout 2017-18.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think just the fact that he added to his offensive game going to the season, he was really a liability on that end. Not to say that he developed the perimeter shooting, but at least he can do something. He can do things with the ball in his hand, dribble, pass, get in the lane. And you mentioned, I know on previous pods, he was one of the highest guys in and ones last year.
Yeah, in terms of and one plays, he was, I believe, top 10 at least, if not, pushing the top 5. And I also mentioned that in my piece as well. It's just because his game and he tightened up that handle a little bit. He worked around the mid range and the elbows and in the post quite well. It sort of just elevated his game offensively and gave him a real weapon that he could go to, and even the coaching staff could go to, and when looking for a play and to get a bucket.
Yeah, that herky-jerky kind of paid off for him. But talking about strengths, obviously we got the mid-range, the post-game, the quickness, the versatility on D, and a solid passer. What are some other strengths for you on Rondae, Jac?
Yeah, getting to the line, Nicholas, we talked about, obviously, the M1 plays. The turnaround jumpers were quite nice. He's a very good rebounder as well. So those are probably a couple of other things. And yeah, the shot creation you talked about, just his ability. Not many of the Nets could sort of create their own shots at will. D'Lo's probably our best guy at doing that. But, Rondae, in terms of his mid-range game, was able to do that at will. When you it was almost like it was money when it came from around that sort of 10 to 12-foot range.
Yeah, he had some stretches where he really got hot, and he was hitting really tough shots too in that mid-range to post area. But on the weaknesses side, obviously, we talked about the perimeter shooting. Can be a little sloppy with the ball. And defensively, I think he has another level to hit. And he is a solid rebounder, but I think he can improve in that area, and that'll come with probably adding more physical strength.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that as well in terms of the weaknesses for me in terms of guarding bigs. Obviously, in terms of when we were playing with small ball fives at times, he would really struggle. And obviously, that's no fault of his own. If he's playing up against an Anthony Davis or Joel Embiid, a guy that's 6'7" up against a guy that's 6'11", 7'1", it's going to be lights out for a guy like Rondae. But he held his own on some occasion. But I think, yeah, the strength, he can be a bit sloppy at times, but his energy can't be questioned. And obviously, yeah, the three-point shooting is one thing that he still made an improvement on, but the form isn't consistent, and unless we see a consistent form, then there will be questions surrounding his game going forward.
Yeah, the free throw percentage, I know we're talking weaknesses, but that was another thing that stuck out strength-wise, but I agree with everything you said. What areas do you think he needs to improve this year?
I think the perimeter shooting, I'd just like to see him have some consistency about it. Not just sort of see a different shot sort of every single time.
Yeah.
We've seen a Markel Fultz, obviously. Everyone's sort of scrutinizing his sort of preseason form, and he looks confident. And we sort of saw that with Rondae last year. The confidence that he showed in terms of his ability to create in that mid range. If he can at least just show some confidence from the area, confidence and competence. It doesn't have to be like absolutely knocked down. You look at Draymond Green's 3-point mechanics. Not necessarily the nicest looking shot, but he takes it when needed. It's just so important to our system, and it makes him somewhat of an offensive liability when he is out there when we don't have that extra stretch and that extra spacing. So for me, the perimeter shooting, I've mentioned the weaknesses, defending above his size. You sort of talked about the strength, so I think that those two things are definitely correlated. But overall, he made so many strides last season that there aren't many weaknesses or improvements other than the main ones that he really does need to make.
Yeah, it's just more so polishing right now. But like you said, the outside jumper, shooting a three, even if it's just from the corner, like we've talked about before, and getting it to a respectable number, doesn't have to be super high. Low 30s would be great. And then, also, like you said, shooting a different jumper every time, it's not going to really look right. So I think he needs to kind of get consistent on that, hopefully put in work this offseason. Then I think consistency on D, like you mentioned the game against Portland, where he was one of probably the best defensive players on the floor. We want to see that more. And I think this year he'll be kind of able to do that and less offensive responsibility. And then, like you said, the physical growth, kind of improving that rebounding area and kind of just using fundamentals to deal with some of the bigger guys, because he's always going to be undersized, especially if they play him at center and power forward. He's going to give up 20 to 50 pounds depending on who he's matching up against.
Yeah, I think all those things were certainly true. And I think in terms of the defensive side of the floor, all the talk that we've mentioned on previous pods as well about the switching becoming a real sort of thing. So we're emulating again the Houston Rockets a little bit further in terms of our defensive schemes now. I think that will certainly benefit a guy like Rondae, who has a really nice lateral quickness and is quite athletic. And I think that will benefit him really greatly.
Yeah, and it seems like he has the energy that he wants to play defense and put in the effort. And like we've said 1,000 times in the show, effort on defense is one of the most important things. Now, how can his teammates help him improve, or his coaches?
Yeah, defensively, it's about putting on the right matchups. There were times where he was just thrown into the wolves and put up a guy like a Kristaps Porzingis, where it's just like, he's not going to do well. You'd rather put out like a Tyler Zeller, not necessarily a Timofey Mozgov, or even Jared Allen for the experience, because Rondae is going to be doing this on a consistent basis. So I think utilizing him in the right matchups and the right lineups is going to be key. And obviously giving him the green light to take shots. He was given that green light from mid-range last season. If Coach Kenny can just go to him, look, if you take these shots, you miss them, you airball, I don't care. I just want you to keep taking them. Just so you can get that confidence in you, and because repetition is key. And obviously, when it comes to the guards and his teammates, it's about the guards finding him in open spots and then being able to space the floor appropriately, so he can get those nice looks from whether it is his mid-range or whatever his spots are, being able to, so he can get into the lane, because he is quite good at getting into the lane. So I think in both ways that there are little things that can happen, but it'll, like we've sort of said about the other players, it'll be upon them to sort of be able to execute what the coaches and their teammates want them to do.
Yeah, I thought that was a great point. You mentioned the matchups and kind of putting him in a really bad situation and then not sending him any help. I think, if he's going to be matched up against a KP, send a double team, especially when you're playing a team like the Knicks sometimes when they don't have other players that you're necessarily scared of offensively, help them out. I think sometimes the Nets do this is where they put their own guy in defensive situation where they're just going to get beat. And that hurts the confidence of the player and the team defensively. So I think kind of helping on that area. Then, like you said, offensively, maybe hitting him in more of his open spots, getting him some more space and finding him places where he can be comfortable, because now we have a better idea of what his game is like. But I think overall, his game is somewhat dependent on himself because he play makes a lot, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah,
what
definitely.
about role on the team? Oh, sorry, Jack. Role on the team for next season, starter or bench player?
Yeah, this one's intriguing, Nick. We've seen that Rondae's still recovering from an injury at training camp. That hip's still giving him a little bit of trouble from that exhibition game that he played in China, I believe, with Jeremy Lin at that camp. He's obviously likely a starter, but with the form of Karras right now, I think he could be pushed to the bench, whether it's early on in the preseason or in the regular season. I think that we're likely to see him in maybe more of a reserve role. There will be certain matchups that will be able to utilize his strengths, but I think going forward, the Nets will be at their best with Rondae as a reserve. I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, there's been a lot of rumblings that the Nets have been playing DeMarre Carroll at the four. You know, why Rondae's been out in
Yeah.
training camp. I wouldn't be surprised to see that a lot. I kind of advocated for that a lot last year. Obviously, DeMarre's undersized and he probably doesn't prefer to play the four, but I think it might be best for the team spacing wise. And obviously, Rondae's lack of 3-point shooting, it's going to be tough because I think he could be a guy that could be impacted by some of the newer players coming to the team, you know, Ed Davis and Kenneth Faried, because you really don't want to put Rondae out there with those guys with the lack of spacing. You know, some moments and, you know, some stints of a couple minutes, it won't be bad, but I think spacing is so important for this offense that it could be interesting to see what happens. I think, like you said, I wouldn't be surprised if they kind of flip flop with the starting lineup. I don't know if they'll do that, but I wouldn't be surprised either.
Yeah, it'll certainly be a storyline that will be to watch going out through the preseason and going into the regular season. I have a Nets Republic piece that'll be coming out in the next 24 hours or so about the preseason game and a few things to watch. And I did mention that 4 position, that 3 position, what's going to happen there. But it'll certainly be fun to watch and see how Coach Kenny goes in terms of the decision he makes.
Yeah, and obviously Jared Allen developing his 3-point shot would help in that area, but you also don't want to kind of take Jared Allen out of his bread and butter in the pick and roll. So it's really going to be a weird situation and see what happens with Rondae. He improved so much, and it'd be sad to put him to the bench because of the improvements he made, but it might be what's best for the team. Now, minute-wise, what do you expect to change for him this year?
Yeah, it was 28.2 last season. I think that it could be somewhere around that same mark, but it could fluctuate depending on his form and the form of his teammates. I'll go with a little bit lower at 27 minutes per game, but I don't think that we'll see anything less than 25 from him and from the coaching staff in terms of how they use him.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're pretty spot on. I think the one thing that'll keep him on the floor is that defensive versatility, which we talked about a little bit before, especially if the Nets are going to switch a lot. Having a guy like him who can defend so many positions, it'll be working on the other things offensively to make him, you know, a little bit better on the floor. You know, maybe developing some of the skill sets we saw from a guy like Andre Roberson, where, you know, you can't shoot the 3 ball, but you're setting a lot of backdoor screens, all types of stuff on the floor, and just causing problems for the defense without the ball in your hands. And I think that's an area where Rondae could help his own self and getting more minutes. But I think 27, 28 minutes should be right. I don't see them jumping up because, like you said, I think some of the other guys can maybe take some of those minutes away. Now, usage rate, do you expect it to be up, down? What do you think?
Well, I think it'll probably be down a little bit, but if he does play with the second unit a little bit more, I wouldn't be surprised to see the ball in his hands a little bit more. 22.2% last season. I think it'll again hover around that mark. He can create his own shot. His dribble has tightened up, and it could tighten up again going into the regular season. So I think it depends on his role, whether it's with the reserves or the starters, how much he sees the ball in his hands. But it'll certainly be about how he's utilized, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. I think if anything, it would probably be a slight bump down because, you know, some of the guys are developing as playmakers and we have more players on the team that are capable of doing things. So I wouldn't be surprised if it took a slight bump, but if he plays with the second unit, it should stay around the same. Now, what are your stats prediction for Rondae? Hopefully we don't have the same ones again.
I don't think we will. I'm going to guess that we don't. I'm just going with the basic sort of stats. I'm going with 13 points per game, 5 rebounds per game, and 3 assists per game. So some drops in certain areas, some increases in certain areas, but overall still a very consistent sort of stat line from a guy like Rondae. What are your numbers, Nicholas?
I got 12 points per game, a shade over 7 rebounds. I have 2 steals, 1 block. I didn't put an assist, but off the top of my head, I'll go with like 2.5, maybe 3. I think that's an area he could improve a lot, but I'm not 100% sure he'll get the opportunity to really play make. What
Yeah,
about
that's the thing.
percentage-wise?
Yeah, the percentage is going to be interesting, Nick. I think it was around that 46% range. I'd be very happy with that if he stays around 45 from the field. His effective field goal, I'd like to see him finally crack that 50% mark, but it is hard for a guy who could barely space the floor. His free throw rate is quite good. We said about that 78% mark. I mentioned that he has the mechanics and the confidence to be able to get to that 80% mark. So for me, the effective field goal at 50%, I think should be a real goal for a guy like Rondae.
Yeah, I'm hoping he can get the field goal percentage. I think he finished last year with like 47. So maybe get that up to a 48, get some of those bad shots out of there. What do you think in 3-point wise? I think last year he shot under 30%. It was in the 20s. Do you think he could get up to like a solid 30 or not possible this year?
Yeah, it's going to be really hard in terms of the attempts that he takes, Nick. I think he was at around 24, 25%. 30% is, even then is still very poor. Anything under 35% is generally a poor 3-point shooter. So I think if we can see him take, if he gets up to that 30% range, it's obviously a massive increase by his own standards, but we need to take that into comparison of, the NBA overall and this Nets team overall. If we have Rondae taking 3-point shots away from a guy like Joe Harris, Alan Crabb, Jared Dudley, all these other guys who are very capable, Shabazz Napier, Trevion Graham, who was really good from there. You'd rather see the ball in those guys' hands and Rondae the one sort of passing it to him, so his assist numbers increase. I'm not necessarily so worried about it, but if it does happen to increase as an overall result in terms of his game and it just happens to increase, then that'd be a nice, happy surprise.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Taking away 3-point shots from other players. I think, in the right situation, the shot clock's expiring. He has the ball in the corner. He's wide open, shoot the shot. Obviously, you don't want him to force it. I think it's just going to be something to keep an eye on. Now, by the end of the season, what are going to be some different storylines or narratives about Rondae?
Yeah, I was going to ask you this question in relation to that, Nick. By the end of the season, do you think Rondae will have solidified his role as an NBA player going forward? His certain archetype. Is he going to be a bench shorter forward? Is he going to be a makeshift starter? Obviously, he's heading into the restricted free agency market. What do you think Rondae, we're going to be talking about at the end of this season? Is he going to be a net long term? Is he going to be shipped off elsewhere so we don't have to pay him? Lots of sort of queries around Rondae and his future as a Brooklyn Net.
Yeah, thanks for asking me the hardest question of the show, Jack. I'm thinking it's honestly going to be super tough. His role and his health is going to determine a lot. I think he's a guy the Nets will keep if they don't land any other big free agents. I don't think he's a priority for them. And I love Rondae. I love them. We share the hyphen and stuff like that. But I think in terms of the offense and how he fits, I wouldn't be surprised if they trade him. If there's a bigger trade on the table to make a move for a star, maybe not even Jimmy Butler, because I don't think the Nets are really pushing for that trade, but maybe somebody else who maybe is available on the market, Rondae would be a guy to include. Or if they want to grab another asset, because I'm not sure if they're fully confident in keeping him. And I think that's just a deficiency in the team. It's not that Rondae's a bad player. I just think he's better off as a bench player moving forward, to answer the other question. I don't think until he develops that 3-point shot, he's going to be able to start unless you have a starting center that can knock down threes. I think what you're looking at in the NBA now is you want 4 guys that can shoot the 3 and 1 guy that can't. If you have 2 guys, now you're really hurting your offense. The spacing just isn't there. Athletes are so fast. Everybody's switching. I think he's a nice guy to bring off the bench, but I don't think he'll be a starter moving forward unless he makes that change and adds the 3-point shot.
Yeah, he's in that similar sort of mold to a Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, Stanley sort of Johnson, guys who are, very capable defensively, and those guys probably are a little bit better than him defensively, but Rondae makes up for it with his offense.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think in terms of those 3 guys, they're all in a very similar sort of mold, obviously, in terms of their skill sets. Obviously, there's some discernible differences, but I think, yeah, all the things you mentioned there, I think if Rondae can add a 3-point shot, then, we'll be happy to give him a hefty contract, but it's going to be a big season ahead for him, D'Lo, all those guys who are hitting the restricted free agency market. And obviously with the amount of cap space that the Nets have as they look to sort of enter free agency with 2 possible max spots available, Rondae's status will be a big question mark going forward.
Yeah, and I think going to the offseason, this is, like I said, no shots at Rondae. I love him as a player. I love the energy. And I hope he improves and develops that 3-point shot so he can be a starter-type player. But I think that would be an area the Nets want to improve, is that power forward position. I think they could make a jump there, make life easier for Jared Allen, just have somebody who can shoot the 3 ball, because we haven't really seen a good stretch 4 in that spot. We've seen Quincy Acey in there, Dante Cunningham, no offense to those guys, very solid NBA players, but we haven't seen anybody close to like an above-average starter to an all-star fringe-type player in that power forward spot with the 3-point shooter, 3-point shots the Nets take. I think it'd be really exciting to see somebody who could play that spot a little bit better.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, it's such an important part of the floor to be able to stretch it. And in terms of our scheme, our offensively and defensively, the 3 and D sort of guy is the perfect fit for there. And Rondae possesses a lot of the skills, except for the sort of some of the really important ones. So let's hope for a big season for Rondae. I'm sure he's in for one, and I'm intrigued to see how he did a really big jump last season.
Yeah. Any last thoughts you want to get on Rondae before we move on to DeMarre?
No, I'm just excited to sort of talk about DeMarre Carroll as well, the swag daddy himself, as our fan and friend Zach Murphy coined him. It's going to be another surrounding Carroll as the really nice bounce back season last year.
Yeah, no, like you said, Jack, last year, career year for a salary dump, which is so funny to think about. Obviously, was that veteran presence for the Nets, helped set the culture, was a 2-way guy. You have any other thoughts about last season about DeMarre?
Yeah, I just thought that his leadership was one thing that really stuck out, and I thought that his impact on the team, just on the court, he provided us with some real composure, but his composure within the locker room and his ability to have a positive effect, both on and off the court, was a real praise of him, and him individually, because character guys are super important, and the relationship that he had with Coach Kenny in Atlanta. Yeah, I think it was a great get by Kenny Marks and Carroll to prove himself as a ready-made NBA player and get back to his best self.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think he took some of the younger guys under his wing, and that really helped. Not only during the season last year, but I think in this offseason, you heard a lot of talk about D'Angelo and Karis LeVert. Now, last year, this is an easy one: success or disappointment?
Success. We can go to strengths, mate. If we're talking about success or disappointment, he's one of the ones that's easy to just give a tick and move on to.
Yeah, and he came with draft picks, so he's like a double success, which ended up turning into Musa. So strengths, though, obviously solid offensive player. He can shoot the three ball. He moves the ball in the offense. He moves himself offensively. Occasional drive. He brings that toughness and energy on D. Just that steadying presence for the Nets team. What are your thoughts on his strengths?
Yeah, really good all-round performer, Nicholas. Both ends of the floor, good rebounder, very consistent. That leadership on the floor to be able to sort of have that experience, that communication to help out a lot of our younger guys. We do have quite a young squad at our disposal. His three-point shooting, he was one of our best three-point shooters. One of the few shooters to sort of shoot above our average percentage. So he was very good from the area. We're talking about that 3-and-D guy. If DeMarre Carroll was a little bit younger, he'd probably be the perfect mold for that. And obviously he didn't have the age on his legs and the time and the experience on his legs. He'd be perfect right now. But yeah, he had a very good season in so many different ways.
Yeah, exactly. And just the fact I keep thinking about that he was supposed to be a salary dump and he just worked out so well. And like you mentioned, the relationship with Kenny, I think, was huge too. Now, weaknesses wise, obviously you mentioned the age. He's not going to get much better. If anything, he's going to decline. He wasn't necessarily super efficient shooting the field goal percentage, but that just wasn't a ton of playmakers on the Nets. And I think he's good at a lot of things, but not necessarily great at a lot of things. What were your thoughts on his weaknesses?
Yeah, I think the eliteness, he wasn't necessarily like the best three-point shooter or the best defender, but you can't necessarily expect that from every single player in the NBA. And I think that the aging in relation to his quickness and athleticism, back in his Atlanta days, that was a real sort of point of like emphasis in terms of his ability to get up and down the floor. So obviously that just comes with age. He's 32 years old now. You mentioned the shooting. His 2-point field goal percentage, almost it was about 5% difference from his three-point shooting. So obviously, if we just took a couple of steps back, it was a little bit better of a
Shoot
drive.
more threes. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, or if he just took those better shots and made them at a higher clip, it would have affected his scoring and the rest. But yeah, there was obviously the necessary weaknesses of his game was sort of out of his control in terms of age and experience and such.
Yeah. Areas you think he needs to improve this year, if any?
I'd say in terms of the three-point shooting, I'm necessarily like 36, 37% is good, but it can still take another jump, another percent or two in terms of his shot selection. Like you mentioned, the percentages weren't great. If he takes those 1 or 2 steps back, or if he passes it off a little bit, I think that he's a really good decision maker. But at the same time, he's got to make the right shots at the right time, not give away fouls and such. But he was a very consistent performer for us, so it's hard to sort of nitpick about the improvements he needs to make, especially for a guy very late and into his career.
Yeah, I think if the Nets got the same thing for DeMarre, maybe just a little bit more efficient from shooting the ball, like you said, not only 2-point, but the 3-point percentage. I think 1 year in Atlanta, he shot like 39%. Maybe try to boost that up a little bit. Defensively, maybe just be a little bit better. But I think if the Nets were to get the same thing they got from DeMarre last year, I think they'd be pretty happy about it.
Yeah, definitely. Especially for a guy going into, he's well over 10 seasons into his career. So generally that's when you see guys drop off. But for him to have such a resurgent year and a career year, who's to say that he doesn't produce more of the same?
Yeah, shout out to the Nets performance team because he shouted them out a lot for getting his knee right and his body right. And he's one guy that you consistently see working out almost every day on, social media at the Nets facility. So that's always a positive too. How can his teammates and coaches help him have a better season?
I think for me, it's about the other players sort of picking up the slack, allowing him to play more of an ancillary role for the team. Guys like Karis LeVert, guys like D'Angelo Russell, Spencer Dinwiddie, these guys making the shots and sort of allowing DeMarre to be more of a help guy, because he seemed quite of a focal point in the lineups and in the games in the Nets wins. And even sometimes in losses. So I think it's about the other guys stepping up and the coaching stuff, sort of being able to relieve his load a little bit. Not necessarily play him all 82 games or play him such a high amount of minutes. Guys can step up, and the depth in our roster now should allow for that.
Yeah, I think you're pretty much spot on. I think the other guys can play better and just not ask him to ever really create and just kind of set him up in good situations, because he did create a little bit last year for himself, had a somewhat success, but I think he's best when he's a spot up shooter or getting that kick out where he can drive to an open lane or something like that. Now, role on the team this year, starter or bench player?
Starter to begin the season, Nick, but towards the end of the season, I think it'd be silly to say that he's still going to be a starter if we want, our young guys to sort of really take those leaps and bounds. We're talking about Rondae a little bit earlier, but if Rondae's still kicking around and his 3-point shot's still on, then Karras and Rondae as a lineup isn't too bad. If Karras' 3-point shot improves, then that really young lineup would be a nice one to see. But I think DeMarre Carroll as a starter, in terms of what he brings, in terms of a level-headed leadership, I think whenever he's got a Nets uniform on, he's most likely to be a starter.
Yeah, I think he just brings that steadying presence to the starting lineup, and that's something that Kenny wants, and having that relationship. And there was times where DeMarre would be out of the game, and then Kenny would just put him back in for like a minute or two to just kind of slow things down. He did a great job last year also when the Nets were like, the other team was on like a 10-0 run. He'd take the ball and go get like an and one to the rim or get some free throws or something just to slow it down and calm down the team. So I think he'll stay in the starting lineup. He obviously could be moved, or you could see somebody jump him by midseason. And unless there's been talk about maybe Caris LeVert jumping the starting lineup, I don't know if that'll happen. If Caris is having as good of a training camp as everyone is saying, then maybe it could happen. But I think right now he stays in that starting lineup. If anything, maybe he slides down a spot. But what do you think about his minutes for this year?
Last season, he led the team in minutes at 29 minutes per game. So I think that could drop and should drop to closer to 25 if our younger guys take the step up and the load is spread across the roster with guys like Trevion Graham and Jared Dudley in his position. So I think a nice little drop for him wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think you'll see him drop down maybe a minute or two, or at least get some more games off. There's obviously less back-to-backs in the NBA, but if we do have a back-to-back, maybe give DeMarre the night off or something along those lines. Now, usage-wise, obviously it wasn't very high last year. Where do you think he'll be at this year?
Yeah, just under 20%. I think it'll probably stay relatively similar. Doesn't need the ball in his hands a lot. He's the sort of guy that makes the shots, doesn't over-dribble the ball. So I think we'll probably see it at a similar sort of rate.
Yeah, I agree. Pretty much spot on right there. Prediction and stats on the season, Jack.
I'm going to go 12 points per game, 2 assists, and 4.5 rebounds. There might be drops in comparison to last season, but as I said, with the minutes dropping, he's likely to have a drop in numbers. But I think if his effectiveness can increase, instead of 37% from the perimeter, 38 or 39, and instead of 41% from the field or around that sort of 40 range, around that 45%, I think that, he can still be a very effective part of this Nets unit.
Not exactly the same, but pretty similar over here. 12 points per game. I got 5 rebounds, 2 assists, 1 steal, 44% from the field, and 38% from 3.
We are very close in our numbers always, Nicholas. We are one mind when it comes to our Brooklyn Nets sometimes.
Yeah, and I think you're not expecting, we can look a lot about last year, and I don't think a ton of the guys other than maybe D'Angelo, Jared Allen, and Caris LeVert, who we'll talk about, are gonna take more of a jump, and some of the other guys will probably stay around the same, if anything, drop off a little bit. Now, what do you think about DeMarre? Do you think he's going to be traded this year, or he'll be on the Nets to the end of the season?
Yeah, that was literally the question I was going to ask you, Nick. So you got to it first, so I'll have to answer it first, mate. I think it's very likely that we do see DeMarre traded. There were a lot of rumblings that we spoke about on the buzz last season in terms of the trade deadline and such, with teams like Detroit who were pushing for a playoff position, teams like New Orleans, the Houston Rockets were even in the market. Zach Lowe brought that up. We spoke about it on another buzz. We speak about it on this podcast. We're really good at covering Nets news, guys. Make sure you subscribe. But yeah, DeMarre, I think, is unlikely to be in net, but that necessarily doesn't mean he's had an unsuccessful stint with the team. It just means, as an expiring contract that other teams might cover him, and we'll be able to get something else in return in terms of turning a dump guy into, extra other picks would be very, very lucrative for a guy who was initially a dump.
Yeah, if Sean Marks is able to get another first-round pick for DeMarre, even if it's late, or maybe like 2 second-round picks, I think that might be one of his best moves other than drafting, Jared Allen and Caris LeVert. But I think DeMarre is likely to be traded now. Jack, do you think if the Nets, hypothetically, let's say we're at the trade deadline the week before, the Nets are locked in as maybe like the 7th or 8th seed, they have like a 1 or 2 game lead on the team behind them. Do you think it's less likely to trade DeMarre because they want to make the playoffs, or it's not really going to have an impact and they have confidence in the other guys?
I think that it depends on the form of the other guys, like you mentioned, Nick. You know, we have Jared Dudley in the reserves. He can be a makeshift starter of sorts. We have Trevion Graham, Karis LeVert, if we're hoping to see him take the next step. I think that it depends on what the turn for the Nets. You know, if we're pushing for the playoffs, you know, there's obviously every chance that we are pushing and want to get those wins. And DeMarre Carroll is a proven part of winning basketball, especially when it comes to our Brooklyn squad. So I think it's less likely if we are pushing for the playoffs. But at the same time, I don't think that it will be the distinguishing factor in terms of trading him. I think that if the deal in return is a first rounder, then I think Sean Marks pulls that trigger and absolutely makes the trade.
Yeah, I think it'll be something to kind of keep an eye on because I think the Nets do believe in the culture and they want to get in the playoffs. And obviously, not that the Nets are going to win a playoff series, but having a veteran like DeMarre, if you're going to the playoffs, would be huge. Obviously, a lot of experience and a lot of guys lean on him. So I think that could have an impact. And I also think the fact that, he really takes care of like D'Angelo and Karis LeVert and a lot of the young guys look up to him. I think the Nets could want to keep him a little bit more. But if they were to get a good offer on the table, I think they would probably let him go and get, that asset back. But it's really a weird situation because we'll see how much the Nets really value culture and leadership and having a veteran like that. Obviously, they've added other names, but DeMarre seems to be like that guy that they all have a really close relationship to, including Kenny.
Yeah, I think Trevor Booker's a sort of a similar one in terms of the deal and he's that we saw last season. I think DeMarre could be on a similar path. Now, Trevor Booker really added to winning basketball for our Nets early in the season before he was traded. He's just a guy who knows how to make the right play on the right side of the floor. He's a man who knows his limitations, similar to DeMarre Carroll. So I think DeMarre is a more coveted asset in terms of his sort of 3-and-D role, but his age is still going to be a question. So if he is healthy, there will be teams clamoring after him because he is the sort of perfect archetype. And Houston don't necessarily certainly think they'll be knocking on the door. And, if they're going to be contending for a championship, they're going to need a guy of sort of DeMarre's ilk up to Lloyd for a reason. So,
yeah. And it also will impact the other Nets stepping up as leaders. Like if D'Angelo and Karis LeVert and Jared Allen or like the Rondae or like these younger guys really become strong leaders on the team, I think it makes it a little bit easier to trade one of your older veterans. But if the team is kind of still all over the place, but you're winning games, you kind of want to have that steadying force. But any last thoughts, Jack, on DeMarre and Rondae?
I think both of these guys are in for fascinating seasons, I think, for different reasons. Rondae's on the rise. DeMarre's in sort of not necessarily the swan song. I still think he's probably got 3 or 4 years left in the NBA. But the differing situations and how they sort of can impact the Brooklyn Nets are going to really determine their future in and outside the organization in the NBA. So going to be a really fun year for these two guys, and I'm fun to see it.
I do have one more question for you regarding DeMarre. If he's not traded, he ends the season with the Nets. Do you see a situation where he's brought back the following season, maybe on like a lesser deal, and kind of just comes back as like a role player?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly could see that. I think in terms of how much we offer him is going to be a real sticking point. You don't want to break a bank for a guy who's hitting the final sort of twilight of his career. But he does, in terms of his love for the organization and the situation, he has spoken volumes of it. So I'm sure he would take a discount of sorts. But in terms of if the Nets strike out on free agents, you can do worse than re-signing a guy who is a great teammate and a great locker room presence. So there is every opportunity that if he's not traded or if he's not bought out or whatever you want to say, that he could certainly be a Net in 2019, 2020 as well.
Yeah, I think they could probably get him back for like a nicer deal too, because he seems to really like Brooklyn, like you said. But that wraps it up for Rondae Hollis-Jefferson, Rondae Hollis-Jefferson and DeMarre Carroll season preview. Jack, always a pleasure talking hoops with you. And like we said, you can check us out on iTunes, Blog Talk Radio, OTGBasketball.com, NetsRepublic.com, Dash Radio, and YouTube. Feel free to subscribe, retweet, share, give us a positive review.